My name is Katrina Mercer, and I'm 34 years old. 10 years ago, my parents believed my brother's lie before I finished a single sentence, and my father threw me out of the house that same afternoon, like I was the one thing in his life he could no longer afford to look at. He said they had invested too much in me for this, too much time, too much money, too much hope. And my mother stood there with her arms folded tight across her chest, staring at me like I had cracked something in her that she did not want to fix. I left with one bag, a phone they stopped answering by nightfall, and the kind of silence that does not end when a door closes. It follows you into every room after that. They were not there when I finished school. They were not there when I got married. They were not there for any of the years I had to build myself back up, without a family, without an apology, without anyone coming after me to say maybe they had made a mistake. Then early one morning, 10 years later, I pushed through the doors of an operating room and found my past already waiting for me. My brother was on the table, my parents were just outside, and the second they saw the name on my badge and looked up at my face, everything in that hallway changed. I had spent a decade becoming someone they never thought I would be, and in less than a minute, they were about to find out exactly what their son had cost them. Before I tell you what he said, Eite, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like where you are? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Long before any of us understood what that house would cost me, it had a system. My parents, Raymond Mercer and Denise Mercer, lived in Louisville, Kentucky, in a narrow brick house on a street where everything looked stable from the outside. Dad sold roofing contracts and talked about money the way some men talk about faith, as if earning it proved character and losing it proved weakness. Mom worked part-time at a dentist's office, kept the kitchen spotless, and treated peace like a job she could not afford to lose. Then there was my brother, Brandon Mercer, 2 years older than me, and born with confidence that made adults lean in when he spoke. He was not smarter than I was. He did not work harder than I did. He understood earlier that in our family, being believed mattered more than being right. I was the daughter who made life easier to manage. I finished assignments early, stayed out of trouble, and learned not to interrupt when Dad had decided what a conversation was going to be. Brandon moved through the house differently. He took up space, borrowed things without asking, and somehow turned every mistake into evidence that he had been under pressure or misunderstood. My parents never said he was their favorite because people like them rarely say the ugly thing out loud. They practiced it instead. If Brandon missed curfew, he had been helping a friend. If I got home late from the library, Dad wanted to know why I thought rules bent for me. If Brandon brought home a report card with one bad grade, Mom said he was adjusting. If I got a 94 instead of a 98, Dad asked what had distracted me. By the time I reached high school, they had built a story about each of us and then started living inside it. Brandon was charismatic, social, destined for something big once he applied himself. I was responsible, serious, useful when I performed well, and disappointing when I needed anything from anyone. That kind of family script does not sound dramatic when you describe it in clean sentences, but it changes the air in a house. You begin to understand that love is graded, weighed, distributed according to who is easiest to admire that week. I stopped expecting fairness and started aiming for results. I joined every advanced science class my school offered, took summer courses at the community college, shadowed physicians when I could, and built my whole sense of self around one clear exit route: medical school. Dad liked that plan because it gave him something impressive to repeat to other people. He never called me gifted when we were alone, but he mentioned my grades at cookouts and church events in a tone that made it sound as if my future had been constructed by his discipline alone. Mom bought folders, planners, exam prep books, and vitamins I never asked for. then reminded me how much all of it cost. Nothing in our house came without a ledger attached to it. Praise was an investment. Support was leverage. Pride arrived with terms and conditions. Still, I took it because I was young enough to confuse conditional love with ordinary life. When I got into a pre-med track program in Nashville, Tennessee, Dad shook my hand before he hugged me. That detail stayed with me because it explained more than the hug itself. He was proud, but he was also formal, almost congratulating himself across my shoulder. Mom cried, then immediately started making lists about tuition, housing, and what I should not waste money on once I got there. Brandon was already drifting by then, living at home off and on, moving through sales jobs and short-lived business ideas, always one good break away from the life he said was coming. My parents called him unlucky. I noticed they never once called him irresponsible. They only asked patience from me, never accountability from him. Nashville gave me distance, which was not the same thing as freedom, but it was close enough to feel new. I rented a small apartment near campus with a woman named Candace Doyle, who became the first person in my life to ask how I was doing and actually wait for the answer. We studied at the same table until midnight, split grocery bills, shared cheap takeout after long labs, and built a routine that did not require anyone to perform for love. Back home, my parents treated my progress like a family project they had financed. Every phone call had an inventory hidden inside it. Was I keeping my GPA where it needed to be? Was I staying focused? Was I remembering what the family had sacrificed? Brandon called more casually, asking about classes, professors, schedules, and the people around me with a level of interest I mistook for support. At the time, I thought distance had improved us. I did not understand that attention can be a form of collection. By my second year in medical school, the life I had worked for finally looked real enough to touch. I had moved into the University of Tennessee College of Medicine track in Nashville, and for the first time, my days belonged more to hospitals, labs, and anatomy review than to whatever story my family preferred about me back in Louisville. Candace Doyle was still my closest person, though by then she had started looking tired in ways that did not match our schedule. At first, it was small things. She stopped finishing meals. She said the fluorescent lights in the library made her nauseous. She leaned against counters when she thought no one was watching. I was the one who pushed her to get checked. And I was sitting beside her when the doctor explained that the problem was serious and fast-moving. Candace had no parents in the picture, no partner, and no sibling nearby who could step in. She had me, unpaid bills, and a body that had started failing her before either of us had accepted that life could change that quickly. I went to the dean's office, explained the situation, and asked for a temporary leave so I could get her through the first stage of treatment and then return. The paperwork was approved. My place in the program was protected. Nothing about it was reckless, secret, or dramatic. It was documented and legitimate. The only mistake I made was calling Brandon after the forms were filed. He listened, asked a few questions, and sounded almost gentle. How long was the leave? Was the school really holding my place? Had I told Mom and Dad everything? Did Candace need money? I answered all of it because I had spent my whole life mistaking curiosity for care. 3 days later, I drove back to Louisville to pick up some things and spend one weekend at the house before returning to Nashville. The second I walked in, I knew Brandon had moved faster than I had. My father was waiting in the kitchen, standing in front of the table with both hands flat on the wood. Mom was near the sink, not crying, not angry, just distant in the way she got when she had already chosen her side. Brandon was there too, leaning against the counter with the stillness of someone who had prepared the room before I arrived. Dad did not ask a question first. He started with a conclusion. He said he knew I had left school, that I had been lying for months, that I had burned through money they had helped me with and attached myself to people who were dragging me down. I tried to stop him before the whole thing hardened, but that was never how our house worked. Once Dad began speaking, everyone else was expected to wait until he was done turning his version into fact. Brandon had told them I was using my friend's illness as cover, that no school would let a student pause everything unless there was already a problem, that I had been falling behind and building an excuse before they found out on their own. He had also told them I was seeing someone unstable and making choices that were ruining the future they had paid toward for years. None of it was true. There was no boyfriend, no missing money, no dismissal. There was a signed leave document sitting in my bag less than 10 feet away, and there was my brother watching my face with the calm expression of someone waiting to see whether the trap would close cleanly. I told Dad to let me get the paperwork. I told Mom to call the school if she wanted proof. I told both of them they could verify everything within 10 minutes. Dad did not want verification. He wanted a fence. He said they had spent too much on me for this kind of humiliation. Too many years building a future I was now throwing away. And that, if I wanted to live like a stranger, I could do it somewhere else. Mom looked at me then, and all I saw in her face was retreat. Brandon never raised his voice. He only made it easier for theirs to stay high. He said he had tried to protect them from the truth until he could not anymore. It was a clean lie because it was built from my real stress, my real distance, and twisted just enough to match the fears my parents were already ready to believe. Dad told me to get out. I went upstairs, pulled clothes from drawers, grabbed my laptop, my notes, and the envelope from school. Halfway down the stairs, I realized I was carrying proof in one hand and the remains of my life in the other, and neither of them was going to matter. I walked out with a duffel bag, a backpack, and the leave paperwork folded where no one had bothered to read it. The first week after I left my parents' house, I learned how quickly pride becomes logistical. I slept one night in my car behind a grocery store parking lot, one night on Candace Doyle's couch with my bag still packed by the door, and by the end of that week I had stopped checking my phone for the kind of message people only send in movies. Nothing came from Louisville except silence. Dad blocked my number first. Mom stopped answering after 2 calls. Brandon sent a single text telling me to stop making things harder for everyone. I read it once, deleted it, and went back to filling out financial emergency forms at school. The leave paperwork that should have protected me did protect my place in the program, but it could not protect the rest of my life. I had to stretch what little money I had, borrow from future loans, and take the kind of campus work students avoid when they still have family to fall back on. Candace's treatment took over our days. I drove her to appointments, sat through long waits in rooms painted to look calming, learned the names of medications I wished I had never needed to know, and watched her become thinner in ways that frightened me more because she kept joking through it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from caring for someone while your own life is collapsing in the background. You function because there is no noble alternative. By the time my temporary leave ended, I had become good at ignoring hunger, sleep, and the ache that came from being treated as disposable by the people who had raised me. I re-enrolled, moved into a smaller apartment I could barely afford, and started building a schedule that allowed me to study before sunrise and work at the hospital records office at night. Medical training in America leaves little room for private ruin. The exams come when they come. The rotations begin whether or not your family has erased you, so I stopped waiting to be restored and focused on becoming useful enough to survive my own future. Candace died the following spring. Not suddenly, not peacefully in the sentimental way people describe when they have never sat in a room that has run out of hope. It happened after months of effort, setbacks, brief improvement, and one final decline that took the last of her strength in a matter of days. I was there at the end because there was no one else to be there. Afterward, I arranged what needed arranging, signed where I had to sign, called the few people she still trusted, and went back to class with the strange numbness grief leaves when it has already exhausted all tears. That was the period when Dr. Helen Parker first took real notice of me. She was an attending surgeon with a reputation for being demanding, precise, and impossible to impress with performance. She asked why I looked like I had not slept in a week, and for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I told her enough of the truth to make her stop and listen. Not all of it. Not Louisville, not Brandon, not the day my father threw me out. Just enough for her to understand that I was balancing more than school and had been doing it alone. She did not offer sympathy. She offered structure, extra research hours when I needed income, a recommendation when I was ready for residency, the kind of practical help that changes the shape of a life because it asks nothing theatrical in return. I graduated, matched into a surgical residency in Indianapolis, and kept moving. Somewhere in those years, I met Daniel Brooks, an engineer with a quiet voice, and the steady habit of asking only what he was prepared to hear answered honestly. He learned my history slowly because that was the only pace I could survive. We married in a courthouse with 6 people present and no one from my side except Aunt Elaine, Dad's younger sister, who had reached me through an old email address after hearing enough half-truths over the years to suspect the whole thing was rotten. She was the only Mercer who ever asked for my side, and then kept listening once she got it. Through her, I learned that Brandon had never let the lie rest. He told relatives I had walked away from medicine, turned bitter, wasted every chance I had been given, and wanted nothing to do with the family anymore. He was not covering one lie. He was maintaining a system. Aunt Elaine also told me something else that stayed with me. Brandon corrected people quickly whenever anyone mentioned I might still be in school, almost before the sentence finished. He did it too fast, with too much detail, as if he had rehearsed the version of me he needed them to keep. That was when suspicion stopped feeling abstract. For years, 10 years after my father ordered me out of his house, Brandon came back into my life on a trauma board. By then, I was an attending trauma surgeon at a major hospital in Indianapolis, living in a brick townhouse with Daniel and a life that looked ordinary from the outside because I had worked very hard to make ordinary possible. I was on overnight call when the page came through just after 3 in the morning, the kind that drags you out of thought and drops you straight into sequence. Motor vehicle collision. Adult male. Internal injuries suspected. Blood pressure unstable. ETA 7 minutes. I dressed by instinct, drove through nearly empty streets, and was already reviewing the likely damage in my head before I reached the ambulance bay. That is one of the strange mercies of medicine. Urgency leaves little room for memory until memory is sitting in your hands. The chart was still being updated when I got to the trauma desk. I picked up the tablet, scanned the intake line, and saw the name Brandon Mercer. Emergency contacts: Raymond Mercer and Denise Mercer. For a few seconds, the noise around me thinned out. I did not feel dramatic, furious, or faint. I felt old, as if the last decade had folded inward and landed all at once behind my ribs. Then training took over. I handed the tablet back, told the charge nurse to page a second attending for standby, and disclosed the conflict before anyone else had to notice it on their own. That mattered to me. If I was going to touch the case, it would be documented, transparent, and clean. The ambulance doors opened less than a minute later. Brandon came in strapped to the gurney, pale, barely conscious, breathing hard against an oxygen mask, one side of his shirt cut open by the paramedics. There was blood on the sheets, but not enough to tell the full story. The dangerous injuries are often the ones you cannot see. I stepped to the rail, listened to the handoff, tracked the numbers, pressed where the abdomen was rigid, and watched the monitor fight to keep pace with what his body was losing. Behind the trauma team, I heard familiar voices before I looked up. My parents had made it in behind the paramedics, still in the clothes people throw on when they leave home in panic. Dad looked smaller than he had in my memory, not weaker exactly, just worn down at the edges. Mom's hair was shorter, her face sharper. And for one brief second I wondered whether she would recognize me before she read the badge. She did not. To them, I was only the surgeon between their son and whatever was coming next. Hospital staff moved them toward the waiting area while I ordered imaging, blood, and prep for the operating room. The scan confirmed what his blood pressure had already been trying to tell us. He was bleeding internally, and he was running out of time faster than his body could bargain for. I scrubbed in with the second attending close enough to take over if needed. Though once the incision opened and the damage declared itself, there was no room left for private history. He had a splenic injury, a liver tear, and active bleeding that needed quick, exact decisions. My hands stayed steady. The residents followed every move. The room narrowed to suction, clamps, count, pressure, control. There was no revenge available inside a sterile field, only competence or failure, and I have spent too many years becoming good at my work to let a man's history with me alter the standard of care he received. The surgery lasted a little over 3 hours. When it ended, Brandon was stable enough for ICU, and the second attending said what colleagues say after difficult cases when they do not yet know the rest of the story behind your face. I washed up, removed my gloves, and stood alone for one moment in the scrub room while the water ran over my hands. Through the glass in the hallway, I could already see my parents waiting to hear whether their son would live. The nurse opened the door for me, and I walked toward them wearing my badge where they could finally read it. The hallway felt longer than it was, bright in that early morning hospital way that makes every face look more exposed than sleep ever does. I could see Dad pacing 2 steps and stopping, pacing 2 more, the same man who once treated certainty like a moral virtue, now trapped in the helpless ritual families perform when medicine is the only thing left to trust. Mom sat with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she was not drinking from. Neither of them knew yet that the surgeon about to update them was the daughter they had not spoken to in 10 years. For all the distance between us, I felt no triumph, only clarity. By the time I reached the waiting area, the shock on their faces had not happened yet, only fear. Dad stood first when he saw me approach, because even panic had never broken him of the habit of meeting bad news on his feet. Mom stayed seated for half a second longer, staring at my scrubs, my expression, the badge at my chest, trying to place what looked familiar before the truth arrived. I gave them the update the same way I would have given it to any family on any other shift. Their son had made it through surgery. He had significant internal injuries, but the bleeding was controlled, and the next several hours would matter. Dad thanked me automatically, then looked down at the badge as if the name had surfaced there out of order. I watched recognition move through him in stages. Confusion, refusal, then the blunt physical understanding that leaves a person briefly unable to speak. Mom's hand tightened around the paper cup until the lid bent. She said my first name like she was testing whether it belonged in the room. I did not answer to it right away. I told them ICU would let them see him once he was settled, and I used Mr. and Mrs. Mercer when I addressed them because there are distances the body learns before the mind can soften them. Dad asked whether it was really me, and I said yes. Mom began crying almost immediately, but not in a way that invited me toward her. It sounded like grief finally reaching a place where denial had been keeping watch. Dad recovered first, or tried to. He asked where I had been all these years, why I never came home, why no one knew I was here. It was a strange question from a man who had thrown me out with a bag in my hand. I told him I had gone exactly where I said I was going all those years ago, back to school, forward, into the life they had decided to disbelieve before checking a single fact. He looked at the floor. Mom kept saying my name, softer each time, as if repetition could repair anything. I did not raise my voice, and maybe that unsettled them more. Anger would have made emotional sense to them. Calm required memory. I reminded them I had offered proof the day Dad expelled me from the house. I had leave paperwork in my hand. I had told Mom to call the school. I had asked for 10 minutes and been denied all 10. Dad tried to say Brandon had told them something different, but I cut that off without changing my tone. He had not merely told them something different. He had lied, and they had preferred the lie because it fit the version of me that asked the least from them. Before either of them could push the conversation into apology, Aunt Elaine stepped through the waiting room doors with the same determined posture she had when she walked into court offices for her accounting clients. I had called her after the case was taken upstairs, not to create a scene, but because she was the only person tied to my family whom I trusted to face the truth without decorating it. She carried a leather folder under one arm, and when she saw my parents standing there, she did not greet them. She set the folder on a chair, opened it, and started removing copies. My old leave approval, screenshots of emails I had sent to an address Mom still used. A scanned copy of the student reinstatement confirmation that proved I had gone back exactly when I said I would. Aunt Elaine had kept them because years earlier I had forwarded everything to her after my parents stopped responding. Not because I believed she could fix it, but because I needed one other adult in the world to know I had not imagined what was happening to me. Dad stared at the papers and kept blinking as though each page required a new adjustment to reality. Mom covered her mouth when she saw the date on the reinstatement letter. Then Aunt Elaine placed one more item on top, and this was the one that changed the room. It was a printed email chain sent from Brandon to a former co-worker, obtained months earlier by that co-worker's ex-wife after a messy split, and passed quietly to Elaine when she realized the family rumor about me did not match what Brandon had once bragged about in writing. In it, he described having handled me before I could embarrass anyone, said our parents would believe him because they always did, and mocked how easy it had been to turn a temporary leave into a permanent family verdict. No one said anything for several seconds after Dad finished reading it. The silence did more damage than shouting could have. Mom sat because her knees no longer trusted her. Weeks later, the consequences settled in without any of the drama Brandon had relied on for most of his life. He survived the surgery, moved out of ICU, and began recovery in a rehab unit where pain and dependence stripped away the performance he had used for years to control a room. I saw him only when my role required it, and even then I kept the contact clinical, brief, and documented. My parents asked to see me twice before Brandon was discharged, and both times I refused. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had finally learned that access is not the same thing as accountability. Aunt Elaine handled what needed handling on the family side. She told me the fallout started almost immediately after the hospital. My grandmother called my parents in tears. Two cousins who had repeated Brandon's version for years stopped speaking to him altogether. The former co-worker whose old email had exposed him agreed to verify it if anyone challenged the chain. Real consequences in America are usually quieter than people expect. They arrive through withdrawal. Returned calls stop coming back. Invitations do not include your name. Trust leaves first, and everything else follows behind it. Brandon had been working in regional equipment sales for a company that prized discretion, especially around clients in healthcare. Once the email surfaced, and once it became clear he had used company time and a work account years earlier to brag about manipulating a family crisis and controlling the story afterward, HR opened a review. He was placed on leave, then separated from the company within a month for conduct they said no longer aligned with the judgment expected in his role. My parents came to Indianapolis 3 weeks after Brandon was discharged. Daniel told me their rental car had been outside for nearly 10 minutes before they finally came to the door. I let them into the house because I wanted the conversation to happen once and only once, in a place where I would decide how long it lasted. Aunt Elaine sat with Daniel in the next room, close enough to hear if voices rose, though they never did. Dad looked older than he had at the hospital. Mom held a bakery box she had brought without asking whether I wanted it, and set it on the counter like a peace offering from a language I no longer spoke. They apologized the way people do when guilt has had time to become organized. Dad admitted he had chosen certainty over truth because certainty made him feel in control. Mom admitted she had watched him end my place in the family and done nothing because she could not tolerate conflict if it meant standing alone in it. Both of them said Brandon had lied, as if the lie had been the whole story. I told them it was not. The lie mattered, but so did the fact that they had found it believable the first time they heard it. So did the fact that they never checked, never paused, never gave their daughter the 10 minutes she asked for when her whole life was still standing in the doorway, waiting to see whether it had a home. I told them I accepted that they were sorry and that it changed nothing. I had built a marriage, a career, a circle of people I trusted, and a life that no longer had an empty seat waiting for them to return and occupy it. They asked whether there was any path back. I said no. Some damage can be repaired. Some damage becomes architecture. The day my father threw me out, my parents stopped being the people I could safely belong to. Dad lowered his head and stayed that way. Mom cried quietly, the sound of someone arriving years too late to a room that had already been closed. When they left, I did not walk them to the car. I locked the door, stood in my own kitchen, and felt something I had mistaken for anger settle into peace. If there is anything in my story worth carrying with you, it is this. The truth does not become less true because a family decides not to hear it, and love that depends on obedience will always fail the first real test. Blood can shape your beginning, but it is not entitled to your future. The people who deserve a place in your life are the ones who check the facts before they judge you. The ones who stay when your version is inconvenient. The ones who do not need your silence in order to feel comfortable. I did not win because my brother lost. I won because I survived the version of my life they tried to assign to me and built one of my own instead. If this story stayed with you, thank you for listening. Tell me honestly, if the door had been yours, would you have opened it at all?